one rectifies one's own character, what difficulty does one have participating in government? If one cannot rectify one's own character, what does one do with rectifying others? In other words, government, the act of government's means as far as the moral activities and cultivation of others, and one has to be of a quality to be able to instill that ideal of correctness in others. There's an interesting quote at 12:7 that I think will help us begin to think about differences among various thinkers. And I wrote this whole quote out so that we could think about it. Zigong asked about government. The master said, if there is enough food and if there are enough weapons, the people will put their trust in it. Zigong said, suppose you definitely had no alternative but to give up on one of these three, which would you really put first? The master said, I would give up weapons. Zigong said, suppose you definitely had no alternative but to give up one of the remaining three, which would you really put first? The master said, I would give up food. From of old, death has come to all men, but a people will not stand if it lacks trust. So, thinking about this, right, the trilogy of food and weapons and trust, I think you can come to sort of an interesting way of comparing and contrasting some of the thinkers that we'll be looking at in the second half of the course as well. So I might suggest then for someone like Zigong, and we'll see that she is someone who praises the place of we might say, some of the domestic arts and the civil arts, and would suggest that maybe, she talks about the goddess series of the harvest and so on, that cultures can't really survive without food and the preparation of food. So, in a sense, you might say Zigong is seeing someone putting food above weapons and trust. And then you might see someone as Machiavelli, and there's a very famous phrase in the Prince, where without the force, right, without the army, without the weapons, your state is non-existent. Without the force, then everything else falls apart. So if Machiavelli was asked this question, right, the weapons that are clearly central, and if you have the weapons, then the trust and the food will follow, right? And then Hobbes, right, again in this funny sort of way, agrees with Confucius, right? We'll see in a strange twisting of this whole logic, but similarly for Hobbes, that ultimately government based on an agreement, right? Some form of agreement among citizens as a basis for maybe not characterized exactly as trust, but some sort of contractual moment, right? Which is the moment at which civil order establishes itself. So I think the sort of question, right? What do you put first? Food, weapons, or trust is actually a good way to think about comparison and contrast of many of the figures that we're going to be looking at over the course of the year. So, what does Confucius say about the actual nature of governance, or how one governs? So he talks about the strength of moral leadership, governing largely by example, that requires one to minimize the use of violence. Now, a commentator on Confucius, Benjamin Schwartz, recognizes here that Confucius appears much more optimistic than Plato. Because what you found in the Republic of Plato is that in order for the guardians to be able to exercise that moral leadership, in the sense they need to be isolated from the rest of society, they need to be placed under a very rigorous program of training, physical training, mathematical training, and they and economic institutions to support their commitment to the truth. So this whole sort of massive re-engineering, social engineering, reorganization of society that is a sort of foundation for the ability of the guardians to rule with truth in mind. Whereas Confucius seems to appear to allow his noblemen and gentlemen to live in the midst of corrupt society and still, because of their principled commitment to humaneness and benevolence, they're able to achieve moral balance and the possible reform of others, right? So if you remember that quote that we looked at a little bit earlier, where it said that the gentlemen or the people, the cultivated individuals are like the wind, right? And the small men are like the grass. And when the wind blows over the grass will bend. Right? So the idea is just by virtue of leading with a certain form of moral authority, there will be a change in the nature of how those below will behave. So in many ways, it's much more optimistic than Plato. You don't require, right, the change and to educate. You just need someone committed to these virtues in the midst of society who can, by their example, basically lead others to follow that example. Again, another reflection of this very basic optimism. At 1219, Confucius tells us, you are running the government, so what is the point of killing? If you desire good, the people will be good. Again, a matter of commitment and example, and the rest will follow. Again, how to lead, 13.2, give a lead to your officials, pardon minor errors, and promote men of quality and talent. Another aspect of governance is to pay attention to the emotional needs of governing behavior, that is privileging a moral economy of shame and self-respect, something that I mentioned last day, over one of fear. So as we see in 2, section 3, the master said, if you lead them by means of government and keep order among them by means of punishments, the people are without conscience in evading them. If you lead them by means of virtue and keep order among them by means of ritual, they have a conscience and moreover will submit. There's a certain parallel between this idea and the Platonic notion that in a good society you have no need for punishments per se, right, if the characters are good, except the difference here is that Confucius doesn't suggest that you need to develop people's character from the beginning in order for them to follow the example of morality. They can initially be corrupt, but if given the opportunity to be led by those who are keeping order by means of virtue, that is sufficient, right, for a certain change. Again, it's to some degree, we also might say here, right, not leading by means of punishment, by means of fear, right, because if you lead by cruel methods, then you develop a population which no longer has a conscience, right? Where if you expect, if you relate to your citizens with the expectation that they are moral agents, then they will live up to those expectations. And to some degree, we might say this is a sort of preemptive response to Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli, of course, suggests that it's better to be feared than to be loved, just avoid being hated, right? So Machiavelli, we'll see next term, promotes the virtue that it's not such a bad thing for a prince to be able to sway his people through the manipulation of fear. Here Confucius says no, right? The public official should not underestimate the power of what perhaps Martin Luther King later called soul force, right? A force of moral authority, that there's a certain type of persuasiveness that comes with moral authority that can be more effective than a sort of Machiavellian fear-inspired form of leadership. We also find here in Confucius a focus on the long term. He tells us at 13:12, if there existed a true king after a generation, whose name this would certainly prevail. So it's a long-term goal, right? A true king, and then wait for 10, 20 years before humanness becomes really big. So let's move a little bit beyond the text and think a bit about some of the broader significance and some of the broader debates surrounding Confucianism. So there is some discussion as to whether Confucianism is replacing Marxism as a sort of dominant ideology in China. We saw some of the evidence for that. I mean, we saw at the beginning of my introduction to Confucius, I talked about the fact that Confucianism in its various strands stood as a major defining doctrine for a lot of East Asian societies up until early in the 20th century with the Communist Revolution in China. Obviously, there was a rejection of Confucianism and all that Confucianism represented in its defense of authority and ritual practices and so on. But what we have seen lately, right, with obviously a lot of revision to communism, the practices of communism in China, we've also seen revisionism in terms of those traditional values. And so there's been some people who have suggested that communism can be relevant, and even the government, right, has begun to adopt this rhetoric of Confucianism. There were ceremonies at the Olympics, which I mentioned before, best-selling books on Confucianism and so on. And so there's been a lot of talk about the revival of Confucianism. And some regard Confucianism as an appropriate, though maybe not comprehensive, insight into broader Asian values, and as a way to maybe understand and help guide Western practice vis-a-vis understanding China as a superpower. So what are some of the implications of if we think about Confucianism as a doctrine, it's a big if, right? If we can somehow understand Chinese politics through the lens of Confucianism, what might it tell us? Well, perhaps, again, this importance in Confucianism between not paying attention to words, right, but what people do. So that may give one insight into a constant sort of criticism and a constant harping on ideas of human rights may have very little effect, right? It's perceived that the West itself may not be living up always to its own ideals of protection of human rights. And in terms of internal reforms within China, there's arguably 6 important ways in which Confucianism poses a challenge to traditional notions of Western liberalism. So, for example, the notion that there's less of a clear divide between public and private. This notion of division between public and private is such a huge part of our public discourse about how we regulate liberal democracies, protecting private domains, private information, and so on. The fact that public-private divide doesn't play out in the same way in Confucianism may be of interest. In addition, the notion of identities as inherited may be of interest in terms of thinking about how the idea of individual rights sort of plays out. Anyway, these are points that I thought in terms of when people think about China going on a trajectory of adopting liberal democratic values, which may not be the trajectory of China at all, but some people have suggested from the West that this is a valuable, and from the East, a valuable trajectory for China to take. There are questions about, where there are questions about the way in which Confucianism can traditionally be allied with and reconciled with a lot of Western liberal notions. And there are interesting debates in various ways. I've recently read an article by May Sim who suggests that there is a place for acknowledging a conception of right within Confucian doctrine, just in a slightly different way from the way in which liberals and liberalism tends to think about human rights. What I perhaps want to focus on more is this argument of Daniel Bell. Daniel Bell is a Canadian political theorist teaching in China. And what Daniel Bell has suggested, Daniel Bell is one of these defenders of Confucianism and thinks that not only is it relevant to China in the contemporary day, which may be somewhat of a controversial issue, it's up for discussion within China, we agree that it is relevant. But Daniel Bell believes that it's relevant and in fact can provide the basis for a sort of modified and a way in which we might fuse Asian notions of governance with a notion of democracy. So he builds this sort of model of what Chinese democracy might look like under a Confucian guise. And he suggests that to see China developing a political system that's more responsive to the people wouldn't mean a model that would be directly exported from the West, a sort of parliamentary or presidential model, one person, one vote model. But he develops an idea that you could develop in China political institutions that would, for example, represent both past and future generations. So have two houses of parliament, one directly elected on a representative basis, much like our House of Commons, but then supplement that with a meritocratic legislature with officials chosen on the basis of competency by exams, a sort of meritocratic addition to government that would deal with matters of global concern and with issues requiring a broader perspective apart from the immediate interests of the electorate or the representatives. So the idea is that Bell suggests that we can somehow distill from Confucianism ideals of meritocratic governance that can be translated, again this is sort of stretching Confucianism quite a way, right? But somehow using these principles to define some sort of institutional framework that could be brought to a practice of democracy with a sort of Chinese, not a twist, it would be like a more correct version of democracy for China because it would be instilled with these Confucian ideas. Also the idea that instead of having sort of ministries to distribute state benefits, that you could do that through families, recognizing the importance of families by being a sort of agent of the state. So there are these theories out there circulating that Confucianism can somehow give us some resources for thinking through a future model of governance within China in which it's more responsive to popular demands without following the model of Western liberal democracy that we have in Canada and the U.S. Still, there is a certain amount of criticism of Daniel Bell's theory. Some suggest that it's looking at Confucianism with the lens of continued parochialism, right? The idea that a sort of Orientalism, that because of Confucianism, China is somehow culturally distinct and therefore needs to be ruled by different sort of standards than the rest, and therefore why shouldn't human rights apply just as equally in China as elsewhere? So these are matters up for debate and discussion within political theory. One other way in which we might think about the broader significance of these ideas is to also think about the ways in which Confucianism can contribute to debates here within the West, ways in which the Confucian tradition might be helpful for the development of democratic discussion in general. So, for example, with the Confucian emphasis on shame and self-respect, in some ways it's a sort of return to what we have begun to see as important. There's all this literature now in Western political theory on the emotions and on thinking about the nature of shame, the value of shame. There's been the introduction of shaming practices sometimes in criminal procedures, they have people with signs saying, I did such and such, and parading back and forth outside courthouses as a way to shame them, as a way of punishing them for their crimes. And there's discussions about the degree to which this is desirable or not. Is it humiliating and degrading, or can shame actually be a positive force for developing conscience, right, and doing the sorts of things that Confucius is talking about. So I think attention to this aspect of Confucius highlights new directions in political theory about ways in which we can think about behavior and behavior in contemporary liberal democracies. In addition, I think Confucianism also provides an interesting corrective. In liberalism, there tends to be, at least in a sort of hyper-liberalism or extreme form of liberalism, with its emphasis on autonomy and individual choice, there tended to be an understanding that our identities were sort of up for grabs, that individuals were free to sort of choose their own identities, choose their own way of life, choose their own goods. And there has been some backtracking on that more recently, maybe apart from those sort of very extreme millions, but the notion that perhaps it's not true that we can choose our identities as freely as we had initially thought. That to some degree, many of us have to live with identities that we are born with, and then the question is, well, how we negotiate those, and how we negotiate between our voluntary and non-voluntary identities. And so, again, Confucianism may help to provide interesting resources for thinking through that type of negotiation. In addition, as I tried to mention in my previous remarks, I think one of the real benefits of looking at Confucius in terms of adding things to the way in which we think about political theory in the West is the way that this sensitivity in Confucianism to a presence, to the performance, to politics as an acknowledgement of not just principles, right? And not just character and not just things sort of internal to the individual, but politics as the way in which words and actions and behaviors have impact upon others. And there's this, I think it opens up a sort of whole new realm of thinking about the world and interactions in the world, the presence in the world, and the politics of those moments of sort of performativity, you might say, of politics, right? The way in which things are received and that I think is interesting and provides a whole new sphere for reflection that I think has been neglected to a large degree within Western thought. So My final comments are just going to develop some of the comparisons among the three figures, Plato, Aristotle, and Confucius. And what I've tried to do in this last section then is to think about these three thinkers involved in sort of some conversation about the good. We find that each of these thinkers can be considered as founders of their own schools. So we have